What if the father of American liberty was not as flawless as the marble statues make him appear? What if George Washington, the revered general, the first president, the very symbol of honor and freedom, was also a man whose life was entangled in contradictions? He was hailed as the liberator of a nation, yet he owned enslaved people who longed for liberation themselves. He was praised for rejecting kingship, yet he ruled with an authority that made some whisper he resembled a monarch in everything but name. He was celebrated as a man of unshakable integrity, yet even Washington understood the necessity of secrecy, manipulation, and compromise in order to keep the fragile new republic alive. The story of George Washington is not merely the tale of a saintly hero on a pedestal. It is the saga of a complex, ambitious, and often misunderstood man. To study Washington is to enter a battlefield where myth clashes with truth, where adoration collides with accusation, and where the foundations of America reveal their cracks and contradictions. In this script, we will journey through the entirety of Washington's life, from his uncertain youth on the plantations of Virginia to his dramatic rise as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, to the impossible challenge of being the first president of a brand new nation. Along the way, we will confront the controversies, his entanglement with slavery, his decisions in war that cost countless lives, the whispered suspicions that he craved power more than liberty, and the lasting paradox of a man who fought for freedom while denying it to others. George Washington is often remembered as the marble giant who stood above politics, but this script will show you the man of flesh and blood, haunted by doubts, tempted by ambition, scarred by defeat, and driven by an iron will to shape a legacy that would outlive him. To truly know Washington, we must be willing to strip away the myths and confront the dangerous question: was he the indispensable man America needed, or the flawed founder whose contradictions still haunt the nation he created? George Washington's life began in uncertainty, not in the certainty of destiny. Born on the 22nd of February, 1732, his father, Augustine Washington, was a planter of moderate wealth who dreamed of raising his family into the upper ranks of Virginia's elite. But when Augustine died suddenly in 1743, young George was just 11 years old, and the family's fortunes plunged into instability. Unlike some of his older half-brothers, George inherited little. His formal schooling ended abruptly. He would never attend university, an intellectual wound he carried for life. Instead, he was forced to carve a future through discipline, ambition, and an iron will. Yet, even in these humble circumstances, seeds of contradiction took root. Washington's childhood exposed him to the sharp edges of inequality. His family owned enslaved Africans who worked the tobacco fields that supported his household. From the very beginning, his identity was intertwined with the moral paradox of liberty and bondage, a paradox that would follow him until his death. By his teenage years, Washington had gained a reputation for precision and calculation. He mastered the art of surveying a profession that required mathematical skill, endurance, and a cold, strategic mind. At 17, he became the official surveyor of Culpeper County, charting the rugged wilderness of Virginia. This work was more than a job, it was a symbol of conquest. Washington's lines and measurements were not neutral. They marked the slow dispossession of Native American lands, a reality that gave young George his first taste of power and expansion. But behind his stoic demeanor lay a restless ambition. Washington admired the wealthy Virginia planters who lived as landed aristocrats. He longed to rise among them, to build an estate, a name, and a legacy that would outlast him. He courted respectability with obsessive detail. He copied out 110 rules of civility in his handwriting, practiced perfect posture, and trained himself to appear calm even when his temper threatened to explode. He wanted to be seen as more than a man, he wanted to be remembered. The path forward came through war. By the early 1752, the French and British empires were locked in competition for control of North America. The Ohio Valley became the flashpoint. Washington, still in his early 20s, volunteered for military service. He saw the army as both a stage for glory and a ladder for social mobility. Here, the contradictions sharpened. He sought honor, but he also sought land. He spoke of defending British liberty, yet his letters revealed his hunger for Western territory that would be taken from its native inhabitants. In 1754, Washington's ambition collided with destiny. Sent as a young officer into the Ohio Valley, he clashed with French forces in what would become the opening shots of the French and Indian War. His rash decision to ambush a French detachment, leading to the death of its commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, ignited an international conflict. Washington had wanted glory. Instead, he had sparked a global war. The incident at Jumonville Glen tainted his reputation, but it also made his name known far beyond Virginia. He was no longer just a provincial surveyor, he was a man who could command attention across empires. Yet the controversy never left him. To some, he was a reckless youth whose arrogance had cost lives. To others, he was a rising star, destined for greatness. The truth was somewhere in between. Washington was learning that power came not only from courage, but also from calculated risk and from the ability to shape the story after the battle ended. From this chaos, Washington emerged hardened. He experienced defeat at Fort Necessity, where he surrendered to the French under humiliating terms. He marched with General Edward Braddock's disastrous expedition in 1755, watching as British troops were slaughtered in the wilderness. Through fire and blood, he learned that war was not glory, but survival. He also learned that reputation could be stronger than reality. Although Braddock's campaign was a catastrophe, Washington's personal courage under fire, his horse shot from under him, bullets tearing through his coat made him a legend among Virginians. By his late 20s, Washington was more than a man of Virginia. He was a man forged by ambition, controversy, and war. He had tasted both defeat and fame. He had seen how fragile empires could be, and how a single man's actions could shape history. Yet in the quiet moments on his plantation at Mount Vernon, he still wrestled with the contradictions of his own existence. The desire for freedom alongside the ownership of enslaved lives, the hunger for honor alongside the fear of failure. The stage was set. America was still a colony, Britain was still the empire, and Washington was still an ambitious planter chasing dreams of status, but destiny was already closing in. The man who once sparked a war in the wilderness would soon ignite a revolution that would tear an empire apart. When the guns of the French and Indian War finally went silent in 1763, George Washington returned to Virginia with scars that were not only physical, but also political. He had survived battles where bullets pierced his coat but not his flesh, yet his ambitions for a permanent commission in the British Army had been denied. To London, he was just another colonial officer, useful in war, dispensable in peace. The sting of rejection never left him. Washington wanted recognition, but the empire refused to grant it. Back at Mount Vernon, his grand estate overlooking the Potomac River, Washington turned to the life of a planter. He married Martha Custis, the wealthy widow whose fortune made him one of the richest men in Virginia. With her came land, enslaved workers, and influence. Outwardly, he became the gentleman he had always dreamed of being. Master of a great plantation, member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, respected figure in colonial society. But beneath the polished exterior, trouble brewed. Britain, victorious over France, now sought to tighten its grip on the colonies. Taxes and regulations poured from Parliament: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts designed to make the colonists pay for the empire's defense. To Virginians like Washington, these measures were not just financial burdens. They were insults. He had risked his life for Britain, bled for the empire, and yet London treated him and his fellow colonists as second-class subjects. The tension ignited Washington's long-dormant resentments. His letters began to echo a new language of resistance. He spoke of liberty, of rights, of a people betrayed by their rulers. Yet here, too, was the paradox. While Washington thundered against British tyranny, hundreds of enslaved men and women worked his fields, denied the very liberty he demanded for himself. The contradiction gnawed at his legacy, even as he rose to prominence among the patriots. By 1774, the colonies teetered on the edge of rebellion. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, and Washington attended in his full military uniform, a silent signal of his readiness to fight. He was no orator, no fiery pamphleteer like Patrick Henry or Samuel Adams, but his presence spoke louder than words. He was the tall Virginian, the man of action, the figure who could bridge the gap between Northern radicals and Southern elites. When the shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the Revolution began in blood. The colonies needed a commander who could unify them, a leader who carried the weight of both military experience and political neutrality. John Adams of Massachusetts rose in Congress and nominated George Washington. His stature, his past, his carefully cultivated image all converged in that moment. Washington was chosen as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But the appointment was not without whispers. Some doubted his ability, remembering his humiliating defeat at Fort Necessity. Others feared his ambition. Was he truly a servant of liberty, or a man who sought personal glory in the smoke of war? Washington, aware of the suspicions, played the role of humility with masterful precision. He accepted the command, but declared he did not seek it and would serve without pay. The gesture disarmed critics and cemented his image as the reluctant warrior. The reality, however, was far from glorious. When Washington arrived in Cambridge to take command, he found the Continental Army less an army than a mob. Farmers with pitchforks, militiamen with mismatched muskets, ill-trained, ill-fed, and ill-disciplined. Desertion was rampant, supplies non-existent, officers quarreled like children. To forge a fighting force from chaos would take not just skill, but ruthless determination. Washington imposed order with an iron hand, whipping, hanging deserters, drilling his men until they could march as soldiers. The Revolution tested him at every step. The Battle of Long Island in 1776 nearly destroyed his army. The British, superior in numbers and naval power, drove Washington from New York. For months, defeat followed defeat, and whispers of his incompetence spread even in Congress. Some even called for his removal. But then, in the frozen December of 1776, Washington gambled everything. On Christmas night, he led his ragged troops across the icy Delaware River and struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. It was a small battle by European standards, but its impact was seismic. In one stroke, Washington revived the Revolution from near death, proving that the cause was not lost, that liberty still breathed. From Trenton to Princeton to the long years of struggle that followed, Washington's leadership became the fragile thread holding the Revolution together. He endured betrayal his own officers plotted against him in the Conway cabal. He endured despair his men starved at Valley Forge, shivering without shoes, their feet stained with blood in the snow. Yet he endured. If the Revolution was a storm, Washington was the mast that kept the ship from breaking apart. Still, the contradictions shadowed him. He spoke of freedom while enforcing harsh discipline. He led men in pursuit of liberty while sending runaways back to Mount Vernon. He carried the hopes of a new nation, but he was haunted by the specter of failure, of being remembered not as the father of America, but as the general who lost everything. By 1781, destiny shifted. With French allies, Washington trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown, and the British surrendered. The war was over. Victory belonged to Washington. Yet the greater test lay ahead, not the test of war, but the test of power. For in that moment, Washington stood at a crossroads. He commanded the only army in America. He was beloved by soldiers, revered by the public, feared by politicians. Many expected him to seize the throne, to crown himself King of America. Had he done so, few could have stopped him. But Washington did the unthinkable. He resigned his command and returned to Mount Vernon. In an age when generals clung to power, Washington gave it up. His act shocked the world. Even King George III marveled, saying that if Washington truly retired, he will be the greatest man in the world. The revolution had been won, but the republic was fragile. And soon the nation would call him again, not as general, but as president. When the guns of Yorktown fell silent in 1781, the United States had won its independence, but not its stability. The newborn republic trembled on uncertain legs, burdened by debt, disunity, and fragile institutions. Washington, weary of war, had retired to Mount Vernon, imagining a quiet life as a planter. But the nation he had helped to free refused to leave him in peace. The Articles of Confederation had created a weak government. States quarreled over boundaries and taxes, trade collapsed, and uprisings like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts exposed the dangers of chaos. To many, it seemed the revolution had only replaced one tyranny with anarchy. Once again, Washington was called upon not to lead an army, but to save the idea of America itself. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention, his mere presence lending legitimacy to the proceedings. He spoke little, but his silence was not emptiness, it was authority. His stature commanded trust, and without him, many doubted the new government would ever take root. When the Constitution was ratified, there was only one man the people could imagine as president. Reluctant, yet bound by duty, Washington accepted. In 1789, he was inaugurated as the first president of the United States, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. The crowd cheered, bells rang, and history pivoted. But the presidency was not a throne waiting for its occupant. It was an untested office, undefined, fragile, and vulnerable to corruption. Washington's every action, every decision, would set a precedent for generations to follow. He understood this burden with grave seriousness. As he wrote, "I walk on untrodden ground." Washington's first task was to transform paper into power. The Constitution created institutions in theory, but in practice there was nothing. No treasury, no judiciary, no cabinet. Washington assembled a team of brilliant but clashing minds. Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury, a visionary who dreamed of a powerful central government and financial empire. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, envisioned a republic of farmers and states' rights. Their battles in Washington's cabinet would shape the nation's political soul, dividing America into the factions of Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Washington, ever the mediator, sought balance. Yet critics whispered that he leaned toward monarchy. He rode in ceremonial processions, allowed himself to be addressed with lofty titles, and dined with aristocratic formality. Was he a Republican president or a disguised king? To some, he was the guardian of liberty. To others, he was a dangerous figure cloaked in virtue. The greatest challenge came not from abroad, but from within. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania rose in violent protest against Hamilton's whiskey tax. The Whiskey Rebellion threatened to unravel federal authority. Washington did what no president has done since he personally mounted his horse, donned his old military uniform, and led an army of nearly 13,000 troops to suppress the uprising. The rebellion melted away before his presence. The image was unforgettable. The first president, sword in hand, riding at the head of an army against his own citizens. To some, it was proof of his strength that the republic would not collapse into lawlessness. To others, it was tyranny reborn, the general turned president showing the iron fist beneath the glove of democracy. Beyond the nation's borders, storms brewed. The French Revolution erupted in blood, and Europe plunged into war. France expected American support after all. Had France not helped Washington at Yorktown? But Washington resisted. In his Proclamation of Neutrality, 1793, he declared the United States would not take sides. This decision enraged Jefferson's followers, who saw it as betrayal of liberty in favor of Britain. Yet Washington knew the fragile republic could not survive entanglement in European wars. His neutrality, controversial in its day, became a cornerstone of American foreign policy. Even as Washington shaped a nation, his personal contradictions deepened. At Mount Vernon, hundreds of enslaved men and women sustained his wealth and reputation. He spoke of gradual emancipation, privately confessing his discomfort with slavery. Yet, as president, he signed laws that reinforced the institution. When one of his enslaved women, Ona Judge, escaped, Washington pursued her relentlessly, using the power of the presidency to reclaim her freedom. He failed. Judge remained free in the North, but the episode exposed the chasm between Washington's words and deeds. After 2 terms, Washington shocked the world once again. Refusing to cling to power, he announced his retirement in 1796. His farewell address warned against political parties, foreign entanglements, and the erosion of national unity. It was both prophecy and plea, a message ignored as often as it was honored. When Washington stepped down, he set a precedent as powerful as any battle he had won: the peaceful transfer of power. In a world ruled by kings and emperors, he had proven that leadership could end by choice, not death. He returned to Mount Vernon, weary but revered. Yet the contradictions lingered. Was Washington a man of the people or a master of power, a liberator or a slaveholder, a republican or a hidden monarch? He was all these things and more. When George Washington left the presidency in 1797, he imagined his last chapter would be quiet. He returned to Mount Vernon, the estate he had built into both a home and a monument to his own vision of gentlemanly life. The plantation bustled with enslaved workers, guests, and political admirers who made pilgrimages to see the man who had led a revolution and rejected a crown. For many, he was no longer simply a man, he was the living embodiment of the new nation. Yet even in retirement, Washington could not fully escape politics. His successors constantly sought his counsel. President John Adams, facing threats of war with France, begged Washington to resume command of the army. Washington agreed, though he knew his health and strength were fading. He could not bear to see the republic unravel, and his willingness to serve even in old age reinforced the myth that he was the indispensable man. But beneath the marble image, Washington remained human. He was plagued by debts from his plantation. His enslaved community grew restless, aware that whispers of liberty floated even into the slave quarters. Washington wrote cautiously about emancipation, privately resolving that upon his death his enslaved workers should be freed. It was a radical step for a Virginian planter, but also a compromise freedom delayed, conditional, and incomplete. In December 1799, winter winds swept across Mount Vernon. Washington, always meticulous, rode out in the cold rain to inspect his estate. He returned, soaked and shivering, but dismissed his discomfort. Within days, his throat swelled with infection. Doctors bled him repeatedly, following the medical wisdom of the time, draining nearly 5 pints of blood from his body. Instead of healing, the treatments weakened him further. On the 14th of December, 1799, George Washington died at the age of 67. His final words, spoken with calm dignity, were said to be, "'Tis well." The news of his death raced across the young republic, plunging the nation into mourning. Bells tolled in every city. Church services overflowed, and people wept in the streets. The outpouring of grief was not just for the man, but for what he represented. America had lost not merely its first president, but its father. In eulogies, Washington was compared to Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer general who returned to his plow after saving the republic. He became less a person and more a myth, a timeless figure enshrined in memory. But history is never so simple. Washington's death did not erase the contradictions that defined him. His will freed the enslaved people he directly owned, but not those who belonged to Martha's estate. Even in freedom, their lives were bound by the chains of delay and dependency. His gesture was extraordinary for a Virginian planter, yet it also underscored how deeply slavery was embedded in the nation he helped build. Washington's presidency set precedents of restraint, yet his actions crushing the Whiskey Rebellion, pursuing fugitives like Ona Judge, revealed an authoritarian streak. He was hailed as the champion of liberty, yet liberty under his leadership was uneven, fragile, and incomplete. The mythmakers chose to smooth these contradictions. Artists painted him as serene and godlike. Biographers like Parson Weems invented stories most famously, The Tale of Washington and the Cherry Tree, in which young George confessed, "I cannot tell a lie." It was a fabrication, but it captured the ideal America wanted, a leader of perfect honesty, perfect virtue, a man without flaws. In truth, Washington was more complicated. He was ambitious, calculating, and often cold. He hungered for recognition, sometimes obsessed over his reputation, and made decisions that cost lives. Yet he also possessed a rare quality, the ability to put the republic above himself. At the moments when history teetered after Yorktown, after 2 terms as president, he chose restraint. He gave up power when others would have seized it. Over 2 centuries later, Washington's face still gazes from currency, monuments, and the Capitol that bears his name. The Washington Monument pierces the sky of the nation's capital, not just as stone, but as a symbol of endurance. His name is invoked by politicians across the spectrum, each claiming his mantle. But beneath the marble and myths lies the deeper truth. Washington was not flawless. He was human, caught in the same contradictions that shaped America itself. He fought for liberty while denying it to others. He dreamed of unity while sowing divisions. He built a republic while benefiting from inequality. And perhaps that is why his story endures. For America is not a perfect nation, but a nation of paradoxes founded on ideals it has often failed to meet. Washington, in all his contradictions, is not just the father of his country, he is the mirror of it. In the years after George Washington's death, the United States entered into a kind of collective memory-building project. The nation needed heroes, figures, who could stand above the chaos of politics, division, and expansion. Washington became the centerpiece of that national mythology. But the Washington who lived in marble and myth was not always the same as the man who had lived and breathed at Mount Vernon. Within months of his death in 1799, sermons, plays, and pamphlets recast Washington in almost biblical terms. He was called the American Moses, leading his people out of bondage to the promised land of liberty. He was likened to Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer who returned to his plow after saving the republic. His humility in stepping down from power was elevated into a divine act, proof that America's revolution had not only succeeded in breaking chains, but in creating a new moral order. The most famous myth came from Parson Weems, a minister turned biographer who published The Life of Washington in 1800. It was Weems who gave America the tale of the cherry tree. Young George, having cut down his father's tree, confessed, "I cannot tell a lie." The story was pure fiction, but it stuck. For generations of schoolchildren, Washington was not a complex man, but the embodiment of honesty itself. Art reinforced this transformation. Painters like Gilbert Stuart and John Trumbull depicted Washington as calm, aloof, almost godlike. In portraits, his face was serene, untouched by the doubts or contradictions of life. In sculpture, he stood as a colossus, a figure above time and conflict. The image was deliberate. America wanted not just a leader, but a saint. Yet the real Washington was more human, more flawed, and far more interesting. He was not always calm. His temper could explode in volcanic rage, terrifying subordinates on the battlefield. He was not always humble. He carefully managed his image, editing letters before publication, and shaping how posterity would remember him. He was not always selfless. He hungered for land, for wealth, for recognition in the eyes of his peers and the wider world. Most strikingly, the man celebrated as the champion of liberty owned hundreds of enslaved people. By the time of his death, 317 enslaved men, women, and children lived at Mount Vernon. Washington's wealth, his lifestyle, even the food on his table depended on their labor. Though he freed his enslaved workers in his will, he never freed them in life. The contradiction is stark. The father of American freedom was also a master of bondage. His military record, too, was more complicated than the myths suggest. Washington was not a tactical genius in the mold of Napoleon. He lost more battles than he won. His true gift was persistence, keeping the Continental Army alive when it should have collapsed, holding the revolution together by sheer will. That endurance, rather than battlefield brilliance, was his greatest military contribution. Even his presidency, often remembered as a golden age of unity, was rife with division. Political parties formed under his watch. Newspapers attacked him with ferocity, accusing him of monarchy, even treason. By the end of his second term, Washington was weary, bitter, and convinced that partisan conflict might destroy the Union he had helped build. Why, then, did America cling so tightly to the myth? The answer lies not in Washington himself, but in what the young nation needed. In the early 19th century, the United States was fragile, fractured by regional differences, threatened by foreign powers, haunted by the unresolved issue of slavery. Washington became a unifying symbol, a figure beyond dispute, a reminder that the Republic had once been led by a man of unmatched virtue. Every generation has used Washington differently. For abolitionists, his decision to free his enslaved workers posthumously was proof that even the father of the country recognized slavery's injustice. For defenders of slavery, his silence on the issue in public was taken as tacit acceptance. For nationalists, his farewell address became a guidebook for unity. For critics of empire, his warnings against entangling alliances became scripture. Washington's image was elastic, able to stretch and bend to fit the needs of the moment. Today, historians wrestle with both the myth and the man. To reduce Washington to a flawless hero is dishonest, but to dismiss him as a hypocrite is equally shallow. He was both and more. His contradictions reflect America's contradictions: liberty and slavery, unity and division, idealism and pragmatism. To understand Washington is to understand the paradox of the United States itself. As the myth fades and the man reemerges, the question grows sharper. Should Washington still be revered? Can a leader who denied freedom to so many still stand as the symbol of freedom itself? Or is his greatness precisely in that contradiction, that he embodied the struggle, the imperfection, the messy birth of a republic still unfinished? Washington's image did not remain frozen in the year of his death. It evolved with the republic he helped to create. In the decades after 1799, his memory became both a sacred relic and a political tool. Every faction, every cause sought to claim him. To Federalists, he was the embodiment of strong government and order. To Jeffersonian Republicans, He was a symbol of the people's will triumphing over tyranny. To abolitionists, he was proof that even a man steeped in slavery could recognize its moral poison. To defenders of slavery, he was the quiet planter who never openly condemned the institution during his presidency. His silence was interpreted, twisted, and weaponized, depending on who spoke his name. The Washington that lived in the national imagination was not one man but many, each shaped by the needs of the moment. As the 19th century unfolded, the myth only grew. On his birthday, citizens gathered in town squares to sing hymns and deliver orations, turning his memory into a kind of civic religion. School children memorized verses extolling his honesty and bravery, repeating the cherry tree tale until it became indistinguishable from truth. Artists painted him crossing the Delaware with icy determination, a scene dramatized into near fantasy. In statues and monuments, Washington became marble, untouchable, eternal. Yet beneath these rituals, America itself was changing. The nation expanded westward, displacing native peoples on a scale Washington himself had once begun as a young surveyor. The republic he had founded was no longer a fragile experiment of 13 states, but a sprawling empire in the making. His image was invoked to justify conquest as much as liberty, order as much as freedom. When the Civil War erupted, Washington's ghost haunted both sides of the battlefield. In the Union, Abraham Lincoln called him the Great Father, whose vision demanded preservation of the Republic. In the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis claimed Washington as a Virginian who had once defied an overbearing government, a parallel to their own secession. Soldiers from North and South marched beneath banners bearing his likeness, believing they fought in his shadow. The contradiction of Washington's life-liberty, entwined with slavery, allowed each side to claim him with conviction. Even in death, he remained both unifier and divider, the mirror of America's deepest struggle. Through the 20th century, Washington's myth became global. In world wars, his name was spoken alongside freedom and democracy, a reminder that the United States had once been a colony that defied empire. His image on currency traveled the world, a face more recognized internationally than many kings and emperors. Yet at home, new generations began to question. Civil rights activists looked at Washington's legacy and saw not just the liberator but the enslaver. Historians dug into archives, unearthing letters and diaries that revealed his careful calculation, his fears, his insecurities. The marble cracked, the man stepped out from the stone, but if Washington's flaws make him human, they also make him enduring. For America's story has never been about perfection, it has been about struggle. Washington's greatness lay not in flawlessness, but in his ability to rise above those flaws at crucial moments. He was not a genius of strategy, but he understood endurance. He was not a visionary philosopher, but he recognized that power, once seized, must eventually be surrendered. He could be cold, ambitious, even ruthless, but he knew when history demanded humility. When the revolution might have become a dictatorship, he resigned his sword. When the presidency might have become a crown, he walked away. In those acts of restraint, he gave the republic its most precious gift, the precedent that power should serve the people, not the man who holds it. As centuries turned, America continued to wrestle with his image. Debates over monuments and memory revived questions once thought settled. Should Washington be honored without qualification, or should his legacy be reframed to include the voices of those he enslaved? The answers remain contested, just as the nation itself remains contested. Yet perhaps the enduring relevance of Washington lies in that very debate. He forces each generation to ask itself what it means to be free, what it means to lead, and what contradictions we are willing to accept in the pursuit of progress. To look upon Washington honestly is to see not a saint, but a paradox. He was a man of the 18th century, shaped by its injustices and ambitions, yet capable of transcending them in moments that define the future. His shadow falls across every president who followed, every soldier who marched beneath the flag, every citizen who invokes liberty with trembling voice. To deny his flaws is to worship a false idol. To deny his greatness is to ignore the fragile miracle of a republic that might not have survived without him. Washington was not the perfect man. He was the necessary man. And so his story continues to echo, not as a tale of unblemished virtue, but as a reminder of the enduring human struggle to balance power with principle. His contradictions are America's contradictions. His triumphs are America's triumphs. His failures, too, are America's burdens. In this way, Washington has never truly left. He lives in every argument over freedom and order, in every debate about unity and division, in every act of leadership tested by history's weight. He lives in the marble monuments, in the fading myths, and in the raw, complicated truth of the nation he helped to create. Washington's legacy lingered not just in the pages of history books, but in the living breath of the republic he had left behind. After his death, Americans began a century-long ritual of invoking his name at every crossroads, as if the nation could not move forward without his silent blessing. The idea of Washington became larger than the man himself. It became a compass, sometimes accurate, sometimes deliberately manipulated to point in the direction people wanted to go. To school children in the early 19th century, he was the embodiment of honesty and discipline, the boy who confessed to cutting down the cherry tree. To politicians, he was the eternal touchstone for legitimacy. A president who wrapped himself in Washington's mantle could claim to be following the path of the founder. An opponent accused of straying from Washington's warnings risked political death. His farewell address was quoted like scripture, his portrait hung in halls of power, his name etched into towns, counties, and eventually the capital of the nation itself. The paradox of his life grew more pronounced as the republic expanded. In the cotton fields of the South, enslaved people heard his name spoken as the father of freedom and wondered why freedom had not yet reached them. In the cities of the North, immigrants arriving by ship learned quickly that Washington was the icon of American identity, a figure whose story they had to absorb in order to become part of the national fabric. For Native Americans, his name often meant conquest, for Washington had once commanded campaigns that drove them from their ancestral lands. He was not a simple hero, nor a simple villain. He was the vessel into which each community poured its hopes or grievances. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederacy summoned his ghost. Abraham Lincoln, desperate to preserve the Union, cast himself as the heir to Washington's mission of holding the Republic together. Confederate leaders claimed Washington's Virginian roots and his resistance to centralized authority as justification for their rebellion. His image was carried into battle on both sides, his likeness appearing in camps where soldiers prepared to kill one another. The irony was sharp. The man who had once fought to bind a fragile collection of colonies into one nation had become a divided symbol in a divided country. After the war, as the United States rebuilt itself, Washington's figure was remade again. The centennial of his birth in 1832, and later the centennial of American independence in 1876, turned him into a national saint. Monuments soared skyward, the most prominent being the Washington Monument in the Capitol, a towering obelisk that pierced the skyline as a declaration of permanence. No longer was Washington just the general of the Revolution. He was cast as the eternal father, whose presence loomed over every generation. The marble image hardened, and with it came both reverence and distance. Ordinary Americans began to see him less as a man of flesh and more as a distant icon, unreachable, infallible, almost divine. But the 20th century chipped at that marble surface. As historians dug into letters and plantation records, the contradictions sharpened. Washington's ownership of enslaved people could no longer be brushed aside as an unfortunate detail. It was central to his wealth, his power, and his daily life. The man celebrated as the liberator of a nation had overseen the bondage of hundreds. Civil rights leaders asked how a republic built on freedom could worship a man who had denied that same freedom to so many. At the same time, admirers defended him, pointing to his decision to free his enslaved workers in his will, an act rare among Virginia planters. The debate was fierce, unresolved, and necessary, for it revealed the complexity not only of Washington, but of the United States itself. Every president who followed him walked in his shadow. Some embraced it eagerly, quoting him, imitating his gestures, hoping to channel his aura of dignity and unity. Others sought to escape it, aware that no matter their achievements, they would always be compared to the man who came first. Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, invoked Washington as a reminder of endurance and sacrifice. John F. Kennedy spoke of Washington as a visionary who had faith in America's youth. Even today, in moments of crisis, Washington's name surfaces as if the living republic still asks, what would he do? Yet the more scholars and citizens examine him, the more he resists simplification. He was not a genius of words like Jefferson, not a master strategist like Napoleon, not a philosopher king. He was a man of discipline, endurance, and caution. He understood power not because he wielded it recklessly, but because he knew when to let it go. That choice, resignation of command after victory, retirement after 2 terms, became his most profound legacy. In those silences, in those withdrawals, he taught the Republic that leadership is not about clinging to authority, but about preserving the nation beyond the self. To stand before Washington today is to feel the pull of both admiration and unease. His portrait stares from the dollar bill, the most common piece of paper in American life, yet his name is spoken in controversies about monuments and memory. He represents both the promise of liberty and the hypocrisy of its denial, and perhaps that is why his story endures. He embodies the contradictions of America itself: ambition and humility, freedom and slavery, unity and division, myth and truth. His life is not a simple tale of greatness, but a mirror reflecting the unfinished work of the nation he helped to create. And so the story stretches on. Generations come and go, each one shaping and reshaping Washington's image. He is never quite the same man twice, never fixed in stone despite the monuments that bear his form. He lives in debates, in classrooms, in arguments about what America was, is, and should become. His myth will continue to be retold, his reality will continue to be re-examined, and between the two lies the uneasy truth. George Washington was not a god, nor a saint, but a man whose choices shaped a world. Washington's shadow never truly lifted from the Republic. His story, retold in every generation, became less about the man himself and more about the meaning people wanted to draw from him. Children in schoolhouses of the 19th century traced his image in primers and sang patriotic hymns that lifted him into legend. Immigrants arriving at crowded ports were told his name as the shorthand for America's promise, the symbol of a land where ordinary men might rise to greatness. But in the slave quarters of Virginia, whispered conversations remembered him differently as the master of Mount Vernon, whose wealth and dignity had been purchased through their bondage. To some, he was the liberator. To others, he was the oppressor. This duality gave his story its staying power because it was never static, never one-dimensional. Washington belonged to everyone and to no one, his memory endlessly reshaped like clay in the hands of a restless nation. Even as the Republic modernized, his lessons were invoked in moments of crisis. During the First World War, when soldiers marched across Europe under the Stars and Stripes, posters called upon Washington's image to remind them that their fight was part of a long tradition of liberty. During the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt referenced Washington as a reminder that America had survived dark winters before and would do so again. His name was invoked in speeches meant to rally the weary and steel the frightened. At times, it seemed Washington was less a figure of the 18th century than a perpetual citizen of the present, summoned whenever the country's endurance was tested. But as history became more searching, the question sharpened. What does it mean that the Father of Liberty owned other human beings? How do we reconcile the image of a general fighting for freedom with the reality of the enslaved men and women laboring in his fields? The 20th century brought with it a reckoning. Historians, no longer content with parables and patriotic myths, unearthed ledgers, diaries, and testimony that revealed the world of Mount Vernon with stark clarity. Names of the enslaved, once erased from the national memory, were restored. Stories of resistance, of escape, of families torn apart under Washington's ownership challenged the neat picture of a man above reproach. His pursuit of Ona Judge, the young woman who fled from bondage in his household, illustrated that the man who once rejected a crown could still cling to his power over another's body and destiny. The debate did not weaken his place in history, it made it more alive. For to confront Washington honestly is to confront America honestly. His greatness is undeniable, but so too are his contradictions. He exemplified endurance, discipline, and humility in leadership, yet carried ambitions that sometimes bordered on obsession. He placed the Republic above himself when it mattered most, yet lived daily within a system that denied liberty to others. In this paradox lies the enduring tension of the United States, a nation proclaiming liberty while shackled by inequality, a nation striving for virtue while haunted by its flaws. Washington is both symbol and mirror. In recent decades, the struggle over his image has grown more intense. Some demand that monuments to him be reconsidered, that his name be weighed alongside his moral failings. Others argue that to diminish his legacy is to weaken the foundation of the Republic itself. Between these poles, scholars and citizens alike search for a middle path, to honor the indispensable man who shaped a nation while refusing to blind themselves to the full truth of his life. For Washington was not marble, and America is not marble. Both are alive, unfinished, capable of greatness, and burdened by contradiction. And so the story continues, flowing through classrooms, political speeches, and quiet family conversations. Washington stands at the heart of America's narrative, not because he was perfect, but because he was human. He showed that leadership requires sacrifice, that freedom requires vigilance, and that the Republic depends on its leaders knowing when to step back. His choice to surrender power first as general, then as president, remains one of the most radical acts in modern political history. It is the act that distinguishes him, that elevates him, that explains why his name endures. When we speak of Washington, we are never just speaking of the 18th century. We are speaking of ourselves, of what we demand from our leaders, of how we balance ideals against reality. His life remains a question posed to every generation. Can a republic built on contradictions survive? The answer, as long as his story is told, remains unfinished. Washington's presence reached into every corner of the young republic long after his body had been laid to rest at Mount Vernon. His likeness appeared on coins, paintings, and in speeches that thundered from pulpits and legislative halls alike. He was a man of flesh who had become a language, a shorthand for unity, sacrifice, and legitimacy. Even when Americans argued bitterly about the future of their country, they reached back to him as though invoking his spirit could settle disputes. He was no longer just a memory, he was the moral scaffolding of the Republic. Yet the scaffolding was contested ground. To farmers struggling against debt in the early 19th century, Washington was remembered as a man who rejected aristocracy, proof that America should remain a land of common people. To bankers and industrialists, he was cast as the defender of order and stability, the proof that America needed hierarchy and discipline to survive. His farewell address was quoted to justify neutrality in foreign wars, but also twisted to argue against reform movements at home. The more the nation grew, the more Washington's ghost was stretched to cover conflicting visions. In this way, he became not only a symbol of unity, but also a tool for division, wielded by each side as if he belonged exclusively to them. When railroads knit the nation together, Washington's face appeared on stock certificates and promotional posters linking his name to the promise of progress. When skyscrapers began to rise, his image adorned cornerstones as if to bless the steel towers with Republican virtue. Even in the age of technology and urbanization, when the world he knew seemed impossibly distant, Americans insisted that Washington was still present, still guiding the course of their destiny. His name was not just a relic of the past, it was a living currency of meaning. But the Civil Rights era brought sharper questions. If Washington represented liberty, whose liberty did he represent? The descendants of the enslaved, who had worked his fields, began to demand that their stories be included in the national narrative. Historians uncovered records of families bought and sold under his authority, of punishments carried out at Mount Vernon, of lives reduced to ledgers. These revelations forced Americans to look at the contradictions they had long tried to ignore. Could a nation still hold him as the father of freedom while acknowledging that his own wealth was sustained by bondage? The question was not rhetorical. It spilled into debates over monuments, school curricula, and the very nature of patriotism. The result was not the destruction of his legacy, but its transformation. Washington could no longer be seen as a flawless demigod. Instead, he became a mirror in which Americans saw themselves, their noblest aspirations, and their darkest compromises. His greatness lay not in perfection, but in the rare discipline of stepping away from power when he might have clung to it. His flaws lay in the system he perpetuated, the chains he left unbroken in his own lifetime. Both truths exist side by side, and together they form the real Washington, neither sanitized nor vilified, but profoundly human. In the modern world, his image continues to travel far beyond American shores. His portrait on the dollar bill is handled by hands across the globe, passed in markets, banks, and black markets alike. Foreign leaders have invoked his name as a symbol of selfless leadership, even when their own rule betrayed the principle. Students in distant countries read about his icy crossing of the Delaware and his farewell to office, marveling at a leader who chose humility over domination. Washington's story became not just American, but universal, a tale about the fragile line between ambition and restraint, power and principle. And yet, in his own homeland, the debates about him remain raw. Some want his monuments preserved unchanged, eternal testaments to the Founding Father. Others argue for plaques, reinterpretations, or even removal, insisting that truth must not be hidden behind marble. This conflict is not just about Washington, it is about how America understands itself, how it wrestles with its sins and its virtues, how it tells the story of freedom that has never been complete. Washington's name is not settled history. It is living history, reinterpreted with every passing decade. The deeper one studies his life, the clearer the paradox becomes. Here was a man who longed for honor but feared disgrace, who pursued wealth yet performed acts of restraint that defined political virtue. He spoke of liberty but owned human beings. He was cautious to the point of hesitation, yet capable of daring decisions that saved a revolution. He was not the cleverest of his peers, but he was the one who understood endurance, the one who understood that a republic's survival depends less on brilliance than on character. He embodied contradictions that still echo in the republic today. Perhaps that is why his story endures, not because it offers easy inspiration, but because it forces confrontation. Every generation must decide which part of Washington to carry forward, the marble myth, the flesh and blood man, or both at once. The republic he founded remains unfinished, and so his legacy remains unfinished. He lives in the questions more than the answers, in the tension between power and restraint, in the gap between freedom promised and freedom delivered. In this way, Washington is not just America's beginning, he is America's ongoing test. Washington's story flows like a river through the centuries, winding and reshaping itself with every turn of the nation he helped to found. In the earliest years after independence, when the Constitution was still an experiment, his name was spoken as reassurance. Farmers at their plows and merchants in crowded ports invoked him to steady their confidence that this fragile republic would not collapse into the chaos that had consumed other revolutions. The French Revolution ended in terror. Europe's monarchies seemed eternal, yet America had Washington, a leader who had laid down power instead of seizing it. That singular act became a shield against fear, proof that this new government could endure. But the further time carried his memory, the more it was polished into perfection. His portraits became smoother, his temper erased, his mistakes forgotten. Children repeated stories of honesty and humility, often fabricated but emotionally powerful. The boy who could not tell a lie stood as a parable for the civic virtues the young nation wanted to instill. The reality of bullets ripping through his coat at Braddock's defeat, the terror of near collapse at Valley Forge, the moments of indecision that nearly lost battles, these were softened until only the triumphs remained. In myth, Washington never doubted, never faltered. In truth, he doubted constantly, and his greatness lay in carrying the weight of that doubt without letting it break him. The 19th century expanded his meaning as America expanded its borders. Washington became the face of manifest destiny, invoked to sanctify conquest of new territories. Politicians quoted him in speeches that promised freedom while delivering dispossession to native peoples. His name adorned towns, counties, and even newborn children across the frontier, as if calling him into existence again would bless new settlements with legitimacy. Yet this too was contradiction, for Washington had once warned against the dangers of unchecked expansion, of ambition that might outpace the republic's unity. In bending his image to their desires, later generations ignored his cautions and instead placed him in the service of their own hunger for land. By the time of the Civil War, Washington had become a battlefield of memory, as fierce as any clash of armies. To the Union, he was the nation's father, whose legacy demanded preservation of the whole. To the Confederacy, he was the Virginian who had once taken up arms against a distant government, their justification for secession. His image hung in both Northern and Southern homes. His name was cried out in both camps, and his statues watched silently as Americans slaughtered one another. The paradox was never sharper. The man who had bound 13 colonies together became the symbol of a war that tore the Republic apart. After the war, as the United States rebuilt, Washington was remade once more into a unifying saint. The Washington Monument rose like a white needle into the sky, a declaration that the Republic, though bloodied, still endured. His story was retold in centennial celebrations, in parades and schoolbooks, as a glue to hold together a country still divided by race, region, and memory. In this remaking, the darker truths of his life, the enslaved lives at Mount Vernon, the ruthless ambition of his youth, the harsh discipline of his generalship were once again buried beneath marble. America needed healing, not complexity, and so Washington became simplicity itself, the perfect leader who had once shown the way. But history does not remain buried forever. The 20th century brought new light, and with it, new questions. As civil rights movements gained strength, the story of Washington as a liberator rang hollow to those whose ancestors had labored without freedom on his estate. Scholars uncovered the names of men and women who had lived under his authority, restoring them to the narrative he once dominated alone. Ona Judge's escape, once a footnote, became a central story of resistance. Hercules, his enslaved chef, became a symbol of both skill and bondage. Washington's legacy could no longer be told without theirs. This reckoning did not destroy his greatness, it reshaped it. For to see him as human rather than divine is to see more clearly what was truly extraordinary. He was not a flawless demigod, but a man wrestling with ambition, fear, and contradiction. He was cautious to the point of paralysis, yet capable of decisive gambles when history demanded. He owned human beings, yet at the end of his life took steps toward emancipation rare among his peers. He yearned for recognition and honor, yet twice surrendered power when he might have kept it. His story, in its full truth, is not less inspiring but more so, for it shows that greatness is not the absence of flaw, but the mastery of flaw in the service of principle. Today, his face still gazes from currency, his name still echoes in speeches, his monument still towers over the capital that bears his name. Yet each generation sees him differently, asks new questions of him, and in doing so, asks new questions of itself. Washington's life is not just America's beginning, it is America's ongoing debate. He forces the nation to confront liberty and slavery, unity and division, ambition and restraint, myth and truth. And perhaps that is why his story endures. It is not finished. It cannot be finished. It lives as long as the republic he helped to create struggles to reconcile its ideals with its realities. Washington's presence has never left the capital that bears his name. Walk along the broad avenues of Washington, D.C., and his memory is stitched into the very stones. The towering obelisk piercing the sky, the avenues named after battles he fought, the statues that mark his calm, commanding posture. Yet the capital city also embodies the paradox of his legacy. It is a city of ideals and power, a stage for democratic dreams and bitter division. To invoke Washington here is to invoke both the soaring aspiration of unity and the constant reminder that unity is always fragile. Foreign visitors in the 19th and 20th centuries often remarked that the United States worshipped Washington the way monarchies revered kings. His birthday was celebrated as a near-sacred holiday. His home at Mount Vernon became a shrine, visited by pilgrims who carried away bits of soil and leaves as relics. In a republic that prided itself on rejecting aristocracy, Washington was elevated to something even higher than royalty, a moral monarch of memory, a sovereign of the nation's conscience. This was both his triumph and his burden. He was no longer allowed to be human in the eyes of his people. He had to stand forever unblemished, even though the records of his life revealed otherwise. In the classrooms of the 20th century, Washington's image loomed over children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Textbooks depicted him as calm, wise, and always right. The cherry tree tale was told again and again, even when teachers quietly admitted it was a fabrication. The myth had a purpose. It was meant to shape citizens, not historians. But as the decades passed and critical study deepened, students began to encounter a different Washington. The ambitious planter, the often frustrated general, the cautious politician. They learned that he had not always known the path forward, that he had doubted, stumbled, and even failed. For many, this revelation made him greater, not lesser. He was no longer a distant marble figure, but a man who carried heavy burdens and still managed to carve a nation from uncertainty. The modern world forced his contradictions into sharper relief. Civil rights leaders pointed to Washington as proof of America's unfinished promises. How could a republic built by a man who owned enslaved people claim to be the champion of global liberty? His pursuit of Ona Judge, his silence on slavery while president, his use of federal power to enforce authority during the Whiskey Rebellion, all were reevaluated as reminders that freedom in America had always been selective. Yet, alongside these critiques, defenders emphasized the moments of vision. his decision to free those he enslaved at his death, his warnings against the dangers of faction, his refusal to seize power when the opportunity was laid at his feet. Both interpretations were true, and together they revealed the central lesson. Washington embodied the contradictions of America itself, its light and its shadow. Globally, Washington became a model invoked far beyond American borders. In new republics across Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar studied his career and sought to emulate his restraint. In Europe, reformers cited his example as evidence that power could be renounced voluntarily, that freedom could coexist with order. His face on the dollar bill, circulated worldwide, became a silent ambassador for the republic he had founded. In this way, Washington became both man and myth, history and symbol, national and universal. And yet, at home, his memory remains contested. In recent years, debates over monuments, curricula, and public spaces have forced Americans to confront whether reverence can coexist with truth. Should statues of Washington remain in public squares without explanation? Should school children still learn the cherry tree myth, or should they instead learn the names of the enslaved people who built his wealth? These questions are not simply about Washington. They are about the identity of the nation itself. To change the way Washington is remembered is to change the way America remembers its own soul. The endurance of his story lies in its ability to hold all of these tensions. He was both liberator and enslaver, unifier and divider, cautious leader and ambitious man. He was a general who lost many battles yet preserved the war. He was a president who faced fierce criticism yet left office beloved. He was a planter tied to the soil of Virginia and a symbol carried across the globe. Each layer contradicts the other, but together they form a whole. To strip away the contradictions would be to strip away the man. Washington's final lesson may be that greatness does not demand perfection. It demands endurance, discipline, and the wisdom to know when to step back. His story asks not that we worship him, but that we understand him, and through him understand ourselves. For as long as the United States struggles with its own contradictions, Washington will remain alive in its memory, both as inspiration and as challenge. In the end, George Washington stands not as a perfect figure carved beyond the reach of time, but as a man whose life reveals the very contradictions of the republic he helped to create. He was a liberator who held others in bondage, a general who lost more battles than he won, a leader accused of monarchy who twice surrendered power. He was ambitious, cautious, calculating, yet capable of moments of breathtaking humility that reshaped the destiny of millions. His legacy is not a story of flawlessness, but of restraint, endurance, and the ability to choose principle over power when it mattered most. The republic he left behind has stumbled, fractured, and healed across centuries, but still it survives. Still it searches for the balance between freedom and order that he once struggled to hold together. Every generation remakes Washington in its own image, seeking guidance, seeking caution, or seeking proof of ideals not yet fulfilled. His name continues to echo because his story is not finished. It cannot be finished. Washington's greatest gift was not victory at Yorktown, nor the presidency he shaped from nothing. His greatest gift was the reminder that leadership is a trust, not a possession, and that a nation's survival depends on those who can walk away from power. The marble monuments will weather and the myths may fade, but the lesson remains. George Washington was not beyond human contradiction, he was defined by it. And in those contradictions lies the enduring truth of America itself, flawed, unfinished, yet still striving. The father of his country left no crown, only a question: can liberty endure, not in the hands of one man, but in the hearts of a people? The answer is still being written, and in that uncertainty, Washington still walks beside us.